Hi, this is Andrea Zamaripa, and this is my presentation on educational equity. Today, I'll be talking about educational equity and why it's such an important part of creating schools where every student has the opportunity to succeed. Throughout this presentation, I'll explain what educational equity means, how demographics influence students' experiences, and why English learners continue to face barriers in California schools. I'll also discuss what educators can do both individually and collectively to create a more equitable learning environments. All right, so what is educational equity? Educational equity is often confused with equality, but they're actually different. Equality means everyone receives the exact same sources, while equity recognizes that students have different needs and may require different supports to be successful. The goal of educational equity isn't to give everyone the same thing. It's to remove barriers so every student has meaningful access to learning and the opportunity to meet high expectations. As future educators, it is our job to make sure that students receive the support they need, not just the same instruction. Here I have a graphic showing equality, which is everybody with the same text and resource. And here is equity, where somebody has a text, somebody has headphones with a tablet and a timer, and somebody else here has a different resource as well. This is equity. This is equality. How is educational equity influenced by demographics? Demographics play a huge role in students' educational experiences. Things like race, language, socioeconomic status, disability, immigration status, and even where a student lives can affect the opportunities available to them. Recognizing these differences doesn't mean lowering expectations. Instead, it helps educators understand what support students might need so they can be successful. Equity isn't really about responding to their individual circumstances. Equity is really about responding to students' individual circumstances while maintaining high expectations for everyone. So these are some of here's a graphic showing different the different demographics that influence equity, and this is why they matter. It could influence demographics can influence access to resources. Equity recognizes that differences. Equity recognizes that these differences and provides appropriate support so that all students can succeed. Educational equity, educational equity, and educational gaps. Educational gaps exist when students don't have equal access to the resources they need to succeed. These gaps can show up in many different ways, including technology access, academic achievement, language support, and culturally responsive instruction. Educational equity works to close these gaps by providing targeted supports instead of expecting every student to learn under the exact same conditions. When schools remove barriers, students are much more likely to reach their full potential. So here I created a chart of examples of what equity looks like for each gap. So for a technology gap, educational gap, so equity would look like providing the proper resources, internet access, and digital literacy support. For cultural gaps, using culturally responsive teaching and inclusive curriculum. For achievement gaps, it would be targeted interventions, differentiated instruction and academic support. And for language gaps, that would look like English language development, bilingual resources, and language scaffolds. The main ultimate goal is to remove barriers so every student has the opportunity to achieve high academic expectations. All right, so educational equity among underrepresented groups. Many student groups have historically experienced barriers that affect their educational opportunities. These include English learners, students with disabilities, students from low income families, LGBT students, foster and homeless youth, and historically marginalized racial and ethnic groups. These barriers often extend beyond the classroom and can include limited access to transportation, healthcare, technology, or academic support. Educational equity focuses on identifying these barriers and, and providing the resources necessary so every student feels included, supported, and capable of succeeding. And here I created a graphic of um, historically marginalized groups that may need extra support and have been underrepresented. All right, a historical problem of practice. So, a historical problem has been the unequal education of access for English learners. So, an example of this educational inequity involves English learners being placed into English only classrooms without meaningful language support. For many years, students assumed that providing the same instruction to everyone was enough. Schools assumed, sorry. However, students who didn't yet speak English couldn't fully access the curriculum. Instead of adapting instruction, schools often expected students to simply adjust on their own. The problem wasn't that the students spoke another language. It was that schools weren't providing meaningful access to learning. So here's like a little graphic showing that. So like we were expecting English only, which created a language barrier, which caused limited opportunities and inequitable outcomes. All right, so a landmark case. This issue eventually led to the landmark Supreme Court case Lau versus Nichols in 1974. The case involved nearly 1,800 Chinese speaking students in the San Francisco Unified School District who were receiving instruction entirely in English without language support. The Supreme Court ruled that equal treatment does not automatically mean equal access. Schools have a responsibility to provide meaningful access to instruction, and this decision helped shape bilingual education and English language development programs that are still used today. So here's like a little graphic showing that timeline. These Chinese speaking students, they had no language support, which led to Lau versus Nichols, moving forward to meaningful access and ultimately the basis for a lot of ELD and bilingual programs. All right, contemporary problem we have today um, is long term English learners. So even though we've made progress since Lau versus Nichols, challenges still exist today. One example is long term English learners or LTELs. These students these are students who remain classified as English learners for many years, even though many have developed strong English skills. Research shows that inconsistent reclassification policies and unnecessary delays can limit student access to advanced coursework and other educational opportunities. This reminds us that educational equity isn't just about providing services, it's also about making sure students can fully participate in every opportunity available to them. I would like to use myself as an example for this contemporary problem. I was not a long term English learner, but I was classified as an ELD. Like ever since my parents put, when they enrolled me in school, they put that we spoke Spanish at home. So it automatically put me as in an English language development program, which I don't believe I really needed because my dad spoke fluent English and I spoke fluent English. And I didn't get a notification that I graduated out of that program till I was in my sophomore, going into junior year of high school. And I believe that I could have been taking in a different English class that would have had more rigorous coursework and I could have gotten more out of those courses had I not been in an ELD program. And this was just simply an overlook. Like I never took a test. I'm not even sure how it happened, but I just remember getting a notification. I had barely recently graduated out of that program when I was going into my junior year of high school. So I had limited opportunities because I was labeled as an English language learner still. And here's some of the research I found through the Learning Policy Institute. Mainly this one I want to highlight. 330,000 students remained classified as English learners for 7 or more years. So this is a lot of students who are missing out on opportunities for more rigorous and higher expectations because they're not being reclassified and they're being classified as English learners. All right, moving on to the impact of migration and immigration. California has one of the most diverse student populations in the country, and migration has greatly influenced our classrooms. Historically, schools were not supposed to meet the needs of multilingual students. Today, classrooms continue to become more linguistically and culturally diverse, which makes equitable language supports even more important. As students, as educators, we need to recognize that diversity is a strength and continue adapting our instruction so all students have meaningful access to learning. All right, individual versus collective efficacy. Educational equity depends on both individual and collective action. So, here are some examples of individual efficacy. So, one teacher can ensure English learners have meaningful access to instruction through scaffolds and culturally responsive teaching. These are examples like I can do this in my own classroom. I can also advocate for a long-term English learner who may need additional supports or reclassification. I could advocate to get them reclassified. And also, like individual actions on my own can improve the outcomes for students within the classroom, as well as one example I meant to include also, but I have here in the photo, is making individual relationships with our students, families, and communities, or with their families, and building that relationship. Collective efficacy would be schools and districts adopting policies that expand equitable access for all English learners. District leaders can improve reclassification practices to reduce unnecessary delays for our long term English learners. And collective efforts create systemic change and larger changes that benefits many students, thousands of students, not just in the district, but maybe it could push for outside of the district and beyond to other school districts to help advocate for larger change for our long-term English learners and English language learners. All right, action. So um, as a these are some classroom level strategies. So as a future English teacher, there are several things I plan to do to support educational equity in my own classroom. I'll differentiate instruction using scaffolds and universal design for learning principles, using culturally relevant literature, explicitly teaching academic language, and building strong relationships with multilingual families, like I spoke about earlier. I'll also regularly monitor student progress and advocate for interventions whenever students need additional support. My goal is to create a classroom where every student feels valued and capable of succeeding. My role beyond the classroom. So basically, educational equity doesn't stop at just my classroom door. I also want to collaborate with colleagues, continue learning through professional development, advocate for English learners outside the classroom, and work with families and community organizations to connect students with additional resources. Creating equitable schools takes teamwork, and I want to be an educator who contributes to positive change beyond my own classroom. All right, before we finish, I would like you to think about, I would like you to take a walk in the shoes of a student who may have, of an English learner. Let's take a look. Let's turn the volume up a little bit. All right, there we go. All right, so we got the idea of this. We're learning fractions in Spanish. Um, if you were given a textbook, a mathematics textbook, to teach you this concept in the language of Spanish, and you just watch this person teach us um, a fraction in Spanish, you may have recognized that you may have recognized the math concepts, but because the lesson was presented in another language, it was probably difficult to fully understand what was happening. Imagine being expected to learn every subject that way, completing assignments and take tests without additional support. Um, this experience helps illustrate why educational equity matters. Simply giving every student the same lesson doesn't guarantee they have the same opportunity to learn. True educational equity means providing meaningful access so every student has the chance to succeed. Thank you.